My early childhood, certainly, and even more recently, as my friend in the front row will testify, obsessed with its sporting cousin, if you like, cricket. So really, when I was asked to put together a course, I really wanted to do the physics of cricket. But then I was persuaded that baseball was actually a good starting place. So that's where I. So because I didn't know anything about the sport, I did what most people would do. They went and talked to an expert, and who better than Hall of Famer Ted Williams. And one of the first things I came across is this one, which is the hardest thing to do in baseball is to hit a round baseball with a round bat squarely. And you know, those of you who are aficionados in the crowd of baseball would probably see this as almost a dismissive description of a very nuanced and subtle game. But it turns out to be a perfect starting place for talking about the physics of baseball. And so we're going to go from here today to one of Ted Williams' other. He turns out to be quite a profound man, aside from being a good baseball player. And he said this: baseball is the only field of endeavor where a man can succeed 3 times out of 10 and be considered a good performer. And so we're going to start from the first quote, and we're going to see how do we get to the second quote. And along the way, I hopefully will at least, as I've tried for the last 38 years with my spouse, try and get you to think about the fact that physics does have a role to play in this. All right? So that's, and please just feel absolutely free to stop me at any point with any questions. So in terms of physics, I've put together some terminology, but don't worry about it. The deterministic piece just means we can predict things. The probabilistic piece means we're tossing a coin. So we're going to go from the first to the second. So the first thing we need to do is, what is determinism? What does that first bit mean? So we have to build a model. We study something, we look at it, we watch a lot of baseball games, we see how people perform, and we need something to describe it. So what is a model? And it turns out that this particular idea, this concept of a model, is quite subtle, and it's hard for people to grasp. So I'm going to use art. Picasso. So this is Picasso's 11 Bulls. How many are familiar with this? So anyway, the way I imagine this, Picasso was sitting at a window looking outside. There's a bull in the field, and he started doing this charcoal sketch of the bull. And then that's the first panel. And then he said, well, it doesn't look as muscular as the bulls you see in the bullfighting ring. So he beefed it up a bit. And then he went through this beautiful exercise in minimalism, in his language, and it's called reductionism in physics, which is you take out the lines till finally, by the time you got to the 11th panel, this one, there's just 5 or 6 lines, but you get the essence of the bull. You've captured the essence of the bull. There's certain questions you can't ask. What's its color? How beefy is it? Does it have big horns? But you can nevertheless see this as a bull. That is what a physics model is about. And so this is what you try and do. You observe something and try and reduce it to its essence. And once you've got that, you can build on it. And so when you go back up the other way, that's where you get your chemistry and biology and engineering and neuroscience and all the other things, actually starting from a principle like this and building it up. So in many ways, that's why I call it an allegory of a physical model. It's actually an allegory of science. So the way down, reductionism. The way up is called constructivism, or what's called emergent phenomena these days. But it turns out that baseball embodies all of this. So there it is. That's the basic thing. And you might say, why round? Why does he say that? Well, if you look at a baseball bat and a baseball sideways, they're 2 circles. So that's it. And once you get that picture, then we're actually all set to go forward with a model. So we look at this and we start putting together a basic vocabulary. So what happens? You hit the ball, it travels a certain distance. It gets there in a particular amount of time. It's traveling at a certain speed. The direction's important because, it could be a foul ball, it could be a home run. It depends on the direction. So you need to factor that in. How big is the bat in relation to the ball? So these are the, are you playing baseball on the moon? Or are you playing it on Earth? These are the types of questions, the basic vocabulary that you can use to build the model. So the simplest model is the idea of a collision. So two objects hitting each other. In this case, the bat hitting the ball. And all of us have had some experience with this bumping into things. So we know what happens. We bump into a heavy object, it hurts more than bumping into a light object. We know that. And all of those things are described by the fellow on the poster, Isaac Newton. And those are his three laws, which basically says that, that moving objects don't change what they're doing unless they're forced, which basically means the ball's moving in this direction and you want it to move in the opposite direction, you've got to do something to it, namely hit it with the bat. The larger the force, the more the change. So the harder you can hit it, the further it goes, or the faster it goes. And the third one is the fact that if one object, if you bump into something and the table hurts you, but weirdly enough, you're hurting the table as well. That means you're pushing it. And in a case like this one, which has wheels, you can check it, because when I bump into it, the table moves. Those are Newton's three laws. And the interesting thing is that as far as baseball is concerned, it all gets embodied in this idea of a momentum. And the momentum is basically, it just basically says that if I give you a choice between being hit by a slowly rolling billiard ball as opposed to a bullet, most of you would pick, all of you would pick, hopefully, the billiard ball. And so it isn't just the size, it is how fast it's moving. That combination of size and speed is what's called momentum. So here we go. This is now the simplest model of a bat-ball collision. Loads of details are ignored, but this is it. So before the collision, the ball, the yellow one in this case, is moving in one direction, the bat's moving in the opposite direction. And they're going to bump into each other. Now the interesting thing here is the mass of the ball is about 5 ounces. The mass of the bat these days is about 33 to 36 ounces. In the old days, it was up to 3 pounds, which was 48 ounces. But nowadays, it's standardized. And so this is an example of a heavy object, something which is 7 times. So it's a gigantic SUV hitting a smart car. And it's moving fast. So the combination of those two things is the essence of baseball. And this is the essence of Ted Williams' original statement. And this is before collision. What happens after collision? Well, it turns out there's this thing that this quantity is, it's called a conservation law in physics, but basically what it means is that whatever you had, the momentum that you had, the sum of the two before, it has to equal the sum of the two afterwards. And forget what I just said, I'll show it to you in pictures. So take a look at this. So notice what happens. This is a bunt. And so it's a little bit fake because the batter is trying to move the bat back anyway, but you can see naturally the ball hits the bat and the bat recoils. Now this is a little more illustrative one where you can see clearly that the bat slows down after hitting the ball, right? That's exactly the conservation of momentum. So it's like money. It's a zero-sum game. I give Carol $1, I lose $1, she gains $1. That's how it works. So, oops, why aren't you moving forward? Bat recoils, bat slows down. All right. Now, there's a complication. And this complication is what starts to make things a little more fun. Because this is where remember what we're doing. We're starting off with a simple descriptive model which allows us to predict things. And then we're going to move to a place where it's all chancy. And how do we get to that? Well, it turns out that even if a ball comes in straight, after it hits the bat, it comes off spinning. And again, this is a diagram. It's taken from a book, a very nice book written by a professor at Yale called Robert Adair. It's called The Physics of Baseball. And this is one of the diagrams taken from his book, but here you can show it. This is from UMass Lowell has a baseball research center. And so you notice that the ball's coming in, if you watch the spots, they're not moving when they're coming in, but once they hit the bat, you notice the spots are spinning. So even if the ball comes in without spinning, once it hits the bat, it comes off spinning. And that is really important, as we'll see. Spin affects all sorts of things. And by the way, the people who studied this initially started off with tennis, because in tennis, this is the game. You want to try and hit the ball with different types of spin, so it does funny things, dips, topspin, side spin, etc. And there's exactly the same thing in baseball. The guy who actually worked on this was a Australian physicist called Rod Cross, who spent, I think, about 12 or 15 years working on tennis, and then suddenly switched to baseball. So if you look at his career, the first 10 to 15 years, he's publishing papers in tennis, and then he switches over to baseball entirely. And this is one of the reasons I think he was able to do that quite naturally. So if you have backspin, it keeps the ball in the air longer, and it actually allows it to, depending on the speed and direction, it allows it to move greater distance. Topspin makes the thing nosedive. Side spin is a slice or a hook. Those of you who have played golf know this. And backspin leads to something which is called paradoxical pop-ups, and I'd like to show you an example of that. So you notice there's the ball, there's the catcher. He says, I've got it. No, I haven't. And you notice, they'll play it again, but you notice the ball lands behind him, and please notice what the ball does once it hits. It's going to, because that shows you clearly that it was spinning. Are you going to show it again? Here we go. So he's running, and then it goes, and notice what the ball does. It hits there and goes back into the... So this is what was called a paradoxical pop-up. So that's what spin can do. So now, when a ball is spinning, you get some additional forces on it. And this particular one is something that people don't know much about. It's called the Magnus Force. And what it does is, as the top picture shows, if the ball isn't spinning, it's moving forward, then what happens is there's the air resistance that's trying to stop it from moving. So it's just like drag swimming in a pool, things trying to push you back. If the ball is spinning, the interesting thing is you get a sidewise force. And that's very special. It's called the Magnus Force. And even in physics community, there's a confusion between the Magnus Force and something that we're more familiar with called the Bernoulli Force, because that's what makes our planes fly. The big difference is this Magnus Force actually depends on the material. For example, so if you take a honey spoon and you twirl it in a glass of water and compare it to what happens when you twirl it in a jar of honey, you know exactly, we all know what happens, right? Much easier to twirl it in the water. That's because the honey is more sticky. That stickiness plays a huge role in this. And this is an important factor because this is what makes playing baseball in Camden Yard or playing baseball in Mile High Stadium very different, because the properties of the air change things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we come to the pitching aspect of it. And before we go there, what I'd like to do is show you another interesting example of the Magnus Force, which so what they're going to do is, this is in a dam in New Zealand.
Recently, some friends of mine went to the
Tasmania, Australia.
Which is 126.5 meters, or 415 feet high. Then they dropped a basketball over the edge. You can see that the basketball gets pushed around a bit by the breeze, but it lands basically right below where it was dropped. Now watch what happens when they drop another basketball, but this time with a bit of backspin. Whoa. Oh,
It went 90 feet sideways. Just with a little bit of spin. That's the Magnus Force.
Dropped it with a bit of spin, like I didn't even throw it, and it just took off. Like, I had no idea that was going to do that.
So it's a tremendously powerful force. And this is what pitchers can use. And I want to show you something very quickly. I don't want you to go through the whole thing. But somebody actually tried to use this idea of a spinning cylinder to replace sailboats and planes. The planes didn't work that well. But the ships actually did. And you'll see an example of one, which is a modern day one, which actually cuts down on the use of diesel fuel. So it's very much a sort of a green technology, if you like.
Here is an experimental rotor wing aircraft, which generates all its lift from spinning cylinders. And this is the
That is.
which uses 4 spinning cylinders, that's 4 Flettner rotors, to increase its efficiency and reduce the amount of diesel it burns. So in the future, the Magnus Effect may help more than just basketball.
So that, by the way, there's a word for this in physics. It's called universality. So if you think back of the picture that I showed you of Picasso's drawing, he did it with a bull. Once you know how to do it with a bull, you can do it with anything. So the same principles apply to a variety of situations. In fact, if you think about it, artists typically start that way. They draw a few lines and they embellish. So they start from that bottom picture and work their way up. And so this is the same principle as the physics version of it. So we saw this. There's another complication in the fact that the ball actually distorts. So it's a round ball, but it doesn't stay round. And how much it actually flattens out depends on the speed. So you can see there's a bunt, there's a fly ball, and there's a home run. And the amount of distortion, and the distortion, how much it distorts, is called the coefficient of restitution, and it depends on how the baseball, the material, if you like. So a softball is different from a baseball. As you can see, in this case, a golf ball and a baseball. One of the things that's interesting is see where the 1938 ball is. So the materials, the change in materials engineering there's definitely been an evolution in the structure of a baseball. There's the bat. The bat is not rigid, it can vibrate. Look at this, you can actually see it. So, what's the difference? The one on the left didn't vibrate that much, the one on the right vibrated like crazy. That's this hitting it on the sweet spot and not hitting it on the sweet spot. And so this leads us to an interesting idea. What is the sweet spot of the ball? Well, it turns out that the bat can distort. And we know, we have all this evidence of the fact that the bat is actually distorted because they break. If you hit it the wrong place, your hands sting. That's why you wear batting gloves. And we know about the sweet spot. And these are the kinds of things the bat can do. We just saw a version of this where the bat was wobbling. This is an aluminum bat. If it's not made out of wood, the wooden bats do this. The aluminum bat also do this. So they can get fatter and thinner. And so if you have a baseball and a ball and a bat, you can actually find the sweet spot by listening for it. Notice, louder, and this is the place where the sound is less, right? That's because of the vibration. Actually, if you attach a piece of paper at the end, it gets amplified, so it sounds better. But the place where the sweet spot is exactly where they put the logo. So you can see it. And this is one of the other sages of baseball, of course, Yogi Berra. And when he was with the Yankees, he was told about this. And when he was told this, he's apparently snarled and said, "They pay me to hit the ball, not to read." So that's the story of the sweet spot.
So quick question.
Yeah.
Usually you should get the speed, the longer the bat is, the further you hit, the more the speed. Why are you hitting it in the middle? It's a combination of the transfer, if you like, this momentum. See,
when the bat vibrates, you're wasting, if you like, some of the stuff. If you hit it at the sweet spot, you've got the maximum transfer to the ball.
But it's halfway down the bat.
Yeah, because the fact that the shape of the bat, you've got different amounts of mass at different points. So that's what it means. That's one of the reasons it'll change depending on aluminum bats, for example. The idea of a sweet spot is somewhat very different actually than wood. And even with wood, different types of wood. These bats are typically, I think, ash, but you can make them out of other woods, and if you do that, it'll change. And it's the size of the sweet spot. Again, in tennis, it's easy because the old wooden rackets, Bjorn Borg used to play with a wooden racket with a tiny sweet spot. These days, everybody plays with a sweet spot where the entirety of the racket is a sweet spot. So it's a very different game, and that has to do a lot with the structural distribution. So here's an example of a bat breaking where it hits outside the sweet spot. So the sweet spot's here, it hit the ball that way, so it broke in a particular way. Here it breaks in a different way, right? Now you can see it from the way the broken part of the bat flies. Here the broken part flies backwards, and here the broken part flies forwards. And it has to do with where the ball is hitting relative to the sweet spot. And that's precisely because of the vibrations that are set up. Okay? And the sweet spot, if you hit it right there, it doesn't vibrate. So the analogy is actually with the fret of a guitar. Put your finger on the fret, that's the place where the thing doesn't vibrate, right? That's exactly what this is. Now, after all this, the important part of baseball is to try and see how far what happens after the ball leaves the bat. Where does it go? And this is one where, with the vocabulary that we had put together, we're actually able to predict in an ideal situation how far the ball travels based on how hard you hit it and what the angle is and where you're playing the game. But reality is quite different because you've got wind resistance and the ball going up and the ball coming down are different, etc. And the best way to actually see this is this table, which basically tells you that if you're at 1,000 feet of altitude, for example, the distance is plus 7 feet, which means it goes 7 feet further. And the home run probability goes up by 12%. If if the pressure changes there, if you've got wind is blowing at 1 mile per hour, or the humidity is 100%, all of these factors affect how far the ball travels. And these are the complications. So again, going back to our Picasso picture, the original, the prediction was based on the little 5-line drawing at the bottom. Here we're trying to actually go up a little bit more and add some of the complications. So this is more of an engineering approach rather than a basic physics approach. And one of the things you see right there at the bottom, aluminum bats, 35 extra feet. So it increases the home run probability, which is one of the reasons when you go lower down in the leagues, people tend to play with aluminum bats. Much easier to get going. I don't want to get into this, but this is an interesting idea because it tells you about, why scuffing the ball and people hiding little pieces of sandpaper, etc., to scuff the ball makes a difference. Because it changes the drag coefficient, it changes what the ball does. And so this is something which is detrimental to the batter, but it's beneficial to the pitcher. So we haven't even got to the pitcher yet. We're just dealing with one side of it right now. Now, many elements, we're starting to see some of the elements that introduce chance into the description. And one of the things that's worth, and this is very, very important in relation to this quote from Ted Williams. Why is that true? Well, it's true because there isn't much time between the ball leaving the pitcher's hand and getting to the batter. And how much is that? Well, we can figure it out. And forget the math. But at the end of the day, it's about 0.4 seconds. And it's about 2 blinks of an eye. Okay? And this is taken from, I think, one of the newspapers where they tried to describe this. The main point of this is that the batter actually sees the ball only till here. From here on out, the batter is blind. So basically, this is where muscle memory, etc., comes into play. Number of repetition, being able to recognize the trajectory of the ball, aiming it. And this is also the reason why quite often if you talk to the batters, you say, I thought I had it, but it suddenly did something. And this idea of suddenly doing something is because they see it here, and the next they see it is there. And when you connect that with a straight line, it's not doing what it was supposed to be doing, what you thought it was supposed to be doing. So the basic message is lots to do and not enough time. And this is, again, for those of you interested, this book by Robert Adair is brilliant. It's really beautifully written. It's written for it was on the bestseller list because it's intended for not people like me. So, and this is the other thing, where you hit it. Ah, wonderful. There it is. Those of you. And again, this is the important part, the bat swing, etc. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Bat swing parameters, there's a bat speed, there's the timing of the swing, there's the swing, the angle at which you do it, which is the tilt, the offset, which tells you whether how close it is to a head-on versus a not head-on collision between the ball and the bat. And all of these things are now tied up in a variety of techniques that now have evolved for getting to the Moneyball stage of the game, where you use all this data. There's lots of data that you can collect. And you can use that data, I'm just showing you some of the things, and you can build these kind of heat maps, which basically, as you can see, the axes, the ball speeds on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the launcher angle, the angle at which you hit the ball. And it tells you, the batting average for balls in play. It tells you how you have to hit, what the speed is, what the angle is in order to have the maximum probability of doing that. The same thing for home runs. And you get these kind of statistics. And this is the kind of extreme data analysis that's being done now by everybody, including Little League, to improve the game. This is a nice one because it has this map, and this is a probability, and it tells you where you can what you have to do to hit a home run, where you get flyouts, bloop singles, etc. Different types of effects, where what the ball does after you hit it is all mapped into this. And you can use this for direct comparison of two batters. And so that is precisely what you use in things like Moneyball to decide whom you want to go for, or how you want to change change your batting lineup based on who's pitching, because there's the equivalent of this for pitchers as well. So you match the data of your batter against the data of the pitcher. And so it's become a very sophisticated game. It's not a game anymore. It's business. Okay, as we just found out. So, of course, the weird thing is every one of these things, this is statistical analysis. So Mark Twain, right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you have, everything has to be dealt with on a case-to-case basis. And here's an example. Oops. Let me see. I have to click on this. Here's a double hit. So this would fall outside the purview of any of the analysis, because all of those are based on a single hit. So this is a good example of that. You've probably noticed somebody's name running through my slides, Alan Nathan. He was a professor of physics at the Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and he's retired now, but he spent, again, a good part of his life working on the physics of baseball. And he was a consultant for a number of teams in the Major League, precisely doing this kind of quantitative analysis and helping them actually set up devices measuring devices to get all this data, some of the data that I showed you. So that's a good site to go to, baseballphysics.illinois.edu. All right. Any questions? Because we're done with one half of baseball. We've still got another half to go, so we got the batters done. So now we go to the other side, the pitching. And here we just, again, you don't have to read everything. There's just certain things that I wanted you to, which I think are fun, which is you're standing up on a mound, so technically there's a downward slope, right? So we're going to ignore that for now. And so the ball has to move about 60 feet before it drops 6 feet. And once you do that, you can actually use some little math, and you figure out that you need to throw it at least 70 miles an hour for it to reach the plate before it hits the ground. Which, the immediately you see that, you realize why the people who throw out their ceremonial pitch, most of them flub it. Because it's not easy to throw a ball at that speed without any practice, you know. So that's really what I wanted you to take away from this. But you can do this. This is also interesting. How much energy? So we saw it from the point of view of the pitcher, how it has to travel. Now the question is, what does the pitcher have to do in order to? How much energy do they exert? How much effort do they put in to do this? Well, if you want the ball to reach the batter at about 90 miles per hour, 0.4 seconds later, you need to throw it about 98. And again, we assume that the pitcher throws it at the same speed. How much acceleration? It's 40 g. 40 times the acceleration due to gravity. Just to give you a sense, a roller coaster is 5g. And there was this absolutely nutty guy called John Stapp who used to strap himself to rocket sleds in 1950s. And it was part of the NASA program. And he would see how fast would he have to go before his eyeballs started popping out. And so 45g is that number. So you really get a sense for, you know, you have to throw it around that much acceleration to get it to where it needs to go at the speed you want it. Then you say, how much power does it take? Well, a garage door opener or a small lawnmower is about 1.5 horsepower. But you know, when you do this, not all your effort doesn't get translated to the ball. Very similar to the sweet spot argument. So you actually need about 3 horsepower, which explains the enormous muscles necessary in the torso and the legs in order for a pitcher to actually generate that kind of power. So it's a tremendous effort to do this. And then, of course, we talked about this, the idea of the ball spinning. The Magnus Effect is something which is a pitcher's friend. You can use this. And, of course, the other things, depending on where you're pitching, the rough ball helps the pitcher, drag forces and other things. And again, I didn't want to get. Now, spin. Different types of balls are spun in different ways. And the way they measured is the revolutions per minute. So again, just to give you a ballpark, 1,200 revolutions per minute is about 20 revolutions per second. So every second, the ball spins around 20 times. It's going to be very interesting when we look at some of the pitches, because for a knuckleball, it spins half a spin in 0.4 seconds. So it's actually 1 spin per second as opposed to 20. So that's why the control that's necessary for a knuckleball is very different from some of these. How you place your fingers relative to the baseball is very important. And a lot of it has to do with the seam. So if you throw it in a way like this, then you notice that there are 2 seams, and they cut the air twice. If you throw it like this, there are 4 seams, and they cut the air differently. Every time these seams, which are a rough surface, they disrupt the air, so they do funny things. So a 2-seamer and a 4-seamer do different things. Okay? So these are all the tricks that pitchers use in order to get the variation. And then you can ask these questions, you know, does a curveball Curve? Absolutely. This is an example of the Magnus Effect. We saw that. We saw that with the basketball, how much it did. And with the baseball, it does that. And this idea of a baseball, can it suddenly break? And that you can't, because remember that was Newton's first law. Everything keeps going unless there's a force. And once the pitcher throws the ball, there's no extra forces except gravity, which is pulling it down, nothing else. So it can't suddenly change direction. But for the batter, they can perceive it as changing direction because they lose sight of it for a window of time. So they see it here, and the next time they see it, it's here. And they draw a straight line, and they say, oh my God, it was going that way, and it ended up going this way. So it's a perception effect. This is a good way of gathering data for pitches. So this is a catcher's view. So what does a catcher do? A catcher's sitting there, they're catching the ball, right? And they put their hand out in different ways to catch the ball. This angle measures that. So this is 0, 90, 180, etc. So you go around the circle. And the concentric circles have to do with how fast it's moving. So if it's moving fast, the faster it's moving, the further out it is from the center. So the closer to the middle circle, it's slower. So here, for example, is different types of pitches are clumped in different ways. So CU is a changeup, and CB is a curveball, etc. So different types of pitches. That circle that came up is a four-seam fastball. And with the fact that it's a fastball is on the outside, there's a two-seam fastball, which is also as far out as you can go. And all of these are normal pitches, and they have predictable movement to the extent that they all clump together. So whenever you have a curveball, all the statistics are lumped here. Important thing to remember, because we're going to see what happens now. I'm going to try and show you a few pitches, and we'll see how this works out. I hope it works out. Okay. Look at that. So, example number 1.
That's a knuckleball, right?
Yep, absolutely. So, that's one. There's another one. And I'm gonna save I'm gonna go to the P3. I'll show it a little bit, because that's one we're gonna talk about a little bit. This one just dips down. And by the way, one of the things this is from Alan Nathan's website, and I picked the same picture in all 4. So this is the variations a single pitcher can handle. And this one is an interesting one. Watch the head of the catcher. His head moves one way, his hand moves the other way. So he thought it was going in one direction over here, and actually ended up somewhere completely different from where he. So that's the one that got Alan Nathan super interested, and he calls it Dickey's wicked pitch, and he's going to, and it was a knuckleball. So he tried to analyze it. And this is Nathan's analysis of the one he called the wicked pitch. This is the one where the catcher's head was moving in one way that was opposite to the way his hand was moving. And the reason is, if the ball had spun once between the mound and the plate, it would have ended up there. Instead, it's moved 1.5 rotations, extra half rotation. That's why it ended up there. And nobody could predict whether it was going to do 1 or 1.5. So that's that's the analysis of why the catcher thought it was going to go one way and ended up somewhere quite different from where he thought it was going to be. So again, going back to this analysis, remember that all the normal pitches have this clumping. We saw that earlier. This there's the fastball there. There's the curveball. Oops. This ring, that's a knuckleball. It's completely random from the catcher's angle. And this totally reinforces Ted Williams' second statement about why somebody who gets it right once out of 3 times is actually doing pretty well in baseball. So you do not have predictable movement. And again, don't forget, we're just slowly crawling our way up the complication ladder. And we've just moved a little bit away. There's another part which is called laminar flow, turbulent flow. And by the way, this is something you can try in your kitchen sink. If you turn on the water, you know what happens, drip, drip, drip. Turn it up a little bit more, it drips faster. Turn it up a little bit more, and what you see is a nice cylinder of water, column. Turn it up a little bit more and watch carefully. And one of the things you'll notice is you get braids. You'll get 2 cylinders or 3 cylinders that are actually braided. Turn it up a little bit more and it starts sputtering and things flowing out. And at the maximum, of course, it's all over the place and you create a mess. That's turbulence. Right? So the first part, that straight column is what's laminar flow. And this turbulence is where it goes all over the place. That turns out to be an important factor of baseball, and this is where the seams come into play. The seams actually break up the air. And they do this. So this is a picture taken again, I believe this is still at the Lowell site, and it's in a wind tunnel with smoke. So these are smoke streams that you can see. And you can see what happens, what's happening away from the ball and what's happening in the neighborhood of the ball. And so this is what you can do with 2 seams versus 4 seams, et cetera. So you've got a very, very sensitive control, if you like, that if you learn how to use it, you can be very effective. And that's what pitchers are able to do. And by the way, at the end of the day, this produces something which I've loved studying for the last 30 years. It's called chaos. So. All right, I'm at the end. So I wanted to make a final connection between baseball and physics. It's some sort of a historical anomaly, if you like. So with possibly the exception of Boston, most people would say that the 1927 Yankees were among the best team ever. And the MVP was none other than Babe Ruth. And of course, Babe Ruth has in connection to this building that we're in. People know about this? Ed, do you want to tell us?
Babe Ruth was sold to the Yankees to raise money for a musical, No No Nanette. And the person that suggested that to the owner of the Red Sox was Winthrop Ames, the person who lived here.
So 1927 Yankees, Babe Ruth. And this, by the way, is the 1927 Solway Conference, which was probably the greatest assembly of physicists ever. These are the guys who, I mean, we're using everything that they talked about, computers, televisions, laser pointers, everything. And the MVP here was none other than Albert Einstein, right? So there's a sort of a, if you like, a mystical connection between physics and baseball. So I hope we've given you at least a flavor for this world. It's a very rich world. It's a intricate world. It's a complicated world. But it provides, at least for me, it's a lifetime of entertainment. So thank you. Yeah.
Paula, that picture of the pitcher pitching, I think was the third one.
Yeah.
It sure looked like it was going straight and then it dropped. And you're saying that can't happen?
Well, it can, but the point is that it has to do with how the okay. What can't happen is the sudden break, because that requires an extra something to happen. It's always following a smooth trajectory. But we don't, if we see all of it, you know, it's like if I saw you at, I don't know, at Corfinius, and then I see you at the library, and I have only those 2 data points, and then I'm asked, you know, where were you heading? I would just connect those 2 with a straight line, and I'd draw it, you know, I'd say you're heading there. But on the other hand, you might be going somewhere quite different if I had more points. You know what I mean? You could, because you'd be moving, you could be moving in a loop, for example. You could be coming back to Corfinius. And I wouldn't be able to detect that just with those 2 points, right? So that, it's exactly the same idea here. Because of the reaction time issue, the batter sees the ball and loses sight of the ball about 0.175 seconds before it gets to him. So at that point, he's calculating that the ball is going in this direction. But then if it does something because of the spin and everything else, and it ends up here, he connects those 2 and he said, my God, it was going that way and it ended up here. And that's what they would call the break. And it can't happen. That's what I'm saying can't happen.
As I understand it, part of that is the batter can't track that ball.
Right.
Once it gets close to him, it's going so fast. Not even people with really good eyesight and fast movement can't track the ball.
That's right.
And so in a sense, the batter's making a prediction based on the data collected over, say, the first half
Right.
or 2/3 of the round.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's of course, I mean, we know this from a variety of things. This is what we call reaction time, right? So, and there are batters who, you know, they become legendary because they, oh my God, he hits it at the last minute. And that's because they've got a slight fraction faster reaction time, which allows them a slightly better estimation in more cases. But again, Ted Williams, instead of 33%, they go to 35%. That's the variation.
Well, apparently, their eyesight's good enough they can see what the seams are doing.
Right.
True.
Pick up the spin as well. Something about the spin.
Yeah. Well, the colored seams definitely help. Yeah. Now, for my friend here in the front row, I have to say the cricket, by the way, has a thicker seam, the cricket ball. And because it bounces off the ground, it has all sorts of other things because it depends on what happens, not just in the air, but what happens off the ground. So that's what makes it even slightly more complicated to analyze. So that's one of the reasons I didn't do it. So. Sorry, there was another question. Yeah.
So in the pitch distributions that you showed, you had a few slides, but specifically the first one, it showed that as the speed increased, the distance from the center, even the one that you just passed, would increase?
No, this is not, these are literally 2 different measures. So every one of these spots is a pitch. And so they use a radar gun to measure the speed. So this one is whatever it is, 75 miles an hour. And the catcher had to move their hand here to get it.
Correct.
So that's 1 dot, right.
So it's showing that as the speed is faster,
yeah.
as the pitcher throws a faster pitch,
Oh, it's going up, you mean?
it's going further from the center
Yeah.
in whatever angle.
No, but it's not, that's what I'm just saying, it's just a representation of the speed. The radius of the circle represents the speed. It's not going in, it's not describing anything about the movement of the ball. So basically, if you throw a pitch, I'm using a radar gun saying Ashna just threw the pitch at 85 miles an hour, and I'm the catcher and I put my hand here to catch the ball. So I've got 2 data points. I mean, I've got 2 coordinates for 1 data point, which is I've got the speed and I've got the angle. And so I'll put a dot here. That's it. It doesn't say anything about where the ball moving.
The position
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it's caught. Okay, gotcha.
It's just a way of representing the fact that all of these pitches that are, if you like, deterministic are clustered. And then you have the probabilistic one, which is a knuckleball that goes all over the place. Yeah, Ed.
I think that's saying the bullseye of the target there is 70 miles an hour.
The bullseye is 70 miles
As
an
you
hour.
move out, it's 5 miles an hour more.
Precisely. Yeah, Kevin.
Talk a little bit more about the why the knuckleball is so erratic?
Oh, because the knuckleball doesn't turn. So the way you throw it, the idea is to keep it without turning. And then because as it's moving, there are forces acting on it, which is the wind drag forces and so on. And so because of that, it turns once. Unlike a pitch that is a spinning pitch, which is doing this, right? So if you throw it with the spin, it's already spinning, and it cuts through the air many times. Whereas a knuckleball will travel for a long time, and right before it gets to an edge here, it does a flip. Or it's coming a certain distance and does a flip here. The two will behave very differently as far as net is concerned as the batter. So that's what makes the knuckleball so random, because you don't know when it's going to do this flip. And it's not just half a flip, it's one turn, but it's a very limited number of turns, as opposed to the others which are spinning 20 turns in a second. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Sort of, yeah.
But sorry, I don't get that, because I would have thought then that the knuckleball should actually be going straighter in terms of its trajectory. But then in that slide which you showed us, it curved away.
Yeah, because of the turn. It's going straight like this, and then it flips a little bit. And the minute it does that, these seams cut across and create the Magnus Force. And that Magnus Force is what leads to it.
Pronounced outswing.
Yeah. You saw what happened with the basketball. Just a little thing like that. He just did that and went off 90 feet.
So it's on a straight trajectory, and then it spins with the knuckle.
Right, which is one of the reasons the knuckleball is this mystical object that suddenly does funny things. Yeah, Ed.
You've mentioned universality. And,
Yeah.
With the exciting sport of curling, if you don't spin the rock, you get a knuckleball, and it's completely unpredictable where it will go.
Yeah.
They have to spin it, which is so counterintuitive, because you would think the spin would make it unpredictable, but they can spin it in such a way that they know where it's going to go.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, a lot of it has to do with the fact that, the curling stone is a fairly, as far as inertia is concerned, it's a large inertial object as opposed to these. So that makes a big difference. And we know that spin does funny things. In football, it stabilizes the ball. The spin is precisely to keep it going exactly on a straight trajectory. Without this thing, it will wobble all over the place, right?
Massage gun versus a one big punch kind of thing.
Yeah, Tim and
Bala, the speed of the ball in, the greater the speed in, the exit speed is greater? Distance of the home run is greater. What's the cause for that?
Well, so what happens is, here's the ball coming in at a certain speed. Suppose we sort of, let's take this is the sort of the infinite baseball bat, very dense, right? And I run into it. The faster I run into it, the harder I'm going to bounce off, right? So that's exactly the same principle. The ball's coming in, it bounces off the bat and goes off. Now, additionally, if the bat is moving, it gives us an added kick. And so it'll actually, if the bat wasn't moving, that's what you're trying to do in a bunt, for example. And in fact, in a bunt, you're trying to move your hand back, so you slow the ball down even more, right? And so by doing these little things, you can control the speed, or you try and control the speed. But technically, it's just this bouncing off thing. And so if it bounces off a stationary object, it comes in at a certain speed, it comes off at the same speed, but moving in the opposite direction. If this is moving, then it comes off at a faster speed, especially because this is a heavier object. Sorry, you had a question.
Does the Magnus Force exist in a vacuum? Or
Yeah.
is it only in a fluid?
Well, it needs a medium. You've actually asked a very interesting question. There are people who are talking about something called a quantum Magnus Force. And the reason is because there's no such thing as a vacuum, right? Because vacuum's got energy, and energy does funny things. But technically, you're absolutely right. The Magnus Force does not exist in a vacuum because it needs a material medium.
With the demonstration of the basketball going over the dam, the Magnus Force is perpendicular to the axis of rotation, right?
Yeah, so
it shouldn't have moved to the side unless they didn't have it perfectly level.
Yeah, so if you take a look at, here. So if you look at the Magnus Force, so the ball's moving that way, and the drag force is exactly opposing the movement of the ball. So if the ball's moving that way, the drag force is trying to slow it down, gravity is going downwards, and the Magnus force is perpendicular to the direction of the ball. So if the ball is moving this way, the Magnus force is in this direction, okay? And that depends on whether the ball is spinning this way or that way. It's either this direction or that direction. Now, when they're dropping the ball like this, gravity is pointing down, the ball is moving downwards, the drag force is trying to point upwards, and because the way they spun it, the Magnus force can either take it this way or that way, and it went that way. So that's because of the way they spun it. Make sense?
Well, you touched a little bit upon the Moneyball game nowadays, and we've heard exit velocities and launch angles and things like that. But one of the key components of Moneyball is what they're calling spin rate. About halfway through last year, the commissioner came in and took away a substance that pitchers had been using to tack up their hands and affect their spin rate. And all of a sudden, pitchers' performance started to drastically decrease. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what was happening there when they took that tack substance away?
Well, it changes the viscosity. So it's because don't forget this. So the way the Magnus force works is as the ball is spinning like this, it's moving this way and spinning like this, right? So one is in the same direction as the movement, the other one's opposed to it. So it's dragging different amounts of material on one side as opposed to the other. And so the material, of course, reacts to it and pushes it in that direction. That's what it is. The stickier the substance, the more asymmetry is created. So in one case, you have the natural stickiness associated with wherever you are, humid room, whatever, honey. In the other case, you're adding to it by adding something. So you're artificially enhancing the stickiness.
So when you take that away, you're taking more spin off the ball.
Right, right. You're getting rid of the size of the Magnus the force in that.
So did they just put the tacky stuff on one side?
No, they put it on their hands.
And they put it on their hands, but depending on how they throw it, they'll get more on some directions than the other.
So what is this so-called hanging curveball? What's happening there?
I think that was an example of that thing that.
So I think that means they didn't get the spin on it that they wanted to.
Right.
So it didn't spin the way they wanted to. So it just kind of floated up there. A curveball is supposed to kind of break off.
And the hanging curveball is not intentional.
It means it didn't.
Yeah.
Screwed up a little.
Yeah, Chandu.
If you wanted to improve your performance as a batter, but not do anything illegal, which means you can't increase the size of the sweet spot, right? Because that's regulated.
Well, people try to do that. I mean, they cork the ball, they cork the bat, and do it. So.
But is it in your interest to have as polished a bat as possible, so that when you hit the ball, you're imparting the maximum amount of force?
No, but don't forget. I mean, this thing, unlike you might be, this is not a cricket bat, right? So this one will, if it's super polished, it can also slide off.
And you touched upon it earlier, I think, because back in the old days, Babe Ruth was notorious for using this big, heavy bat that an average person couldn't swing, 44 ounces, I think. Barry Bonds, who's the leading home run hitter of all time now, used a 31-ounce bat. So it was like smaller than most little leaguers use.
Right.
So is that a speed of swing?
Yeah, it's a bat speed issue. Yeah, heavy bat, slower bat speed, more power, lighter bat, higher bat speed. And as you saw from this, bat speed is an important component to how far the ball goes. And certainly the heat map shows you that the bat speed is a really important component to hitting home runs. So.
Is there a pitch that goes straight and then goes up?
Yeah, I was going to ask that question too, because in softball, not in baseball so much, but in softball you hear the riser. Right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that's an illusion.
Not a unicorn.
Yeah, no, it could. I mean, I don't see in principle there shouldn't be anything, because don't forget, it all has to do with if the Magnus force is pointing up, and that means how is the ball spinning, right? So if you want it to go up, right, you need to be spinning this way. So it's almost like a top spin. So in principle, there should be no problem. It's whether you can get the ball to spin that way. That's a different story.
I wonder if it's arm angle.
It could very well.
Some pitchers will start low.
With the low, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one in cricket, right? I mean, that people.
Yeah, but in baseball, you can only pitch this way, isn't it? I mean, you never.